I'm going to show you how to run background tasks in App Engine applications using queues. When a conference is created, you can imagine that there might be a variety of tasks that need to be executed, such as starting the process to book the venue, creating the agenda, organising the catering, and sending a confirmation email to the organiser. You'd want to do all of these tasks in the background rather than trying to complete everything before the Create Conference function returns. In this exercise, we're going to use the default task queue to send a confirmation email, like this one, when someone creates a conference. The learning goal is to understand how to use task queues, but you could imagine that there are many other tasks that needed to be completed when a new conference is created. To execute a task in the background using a task queue, the first thing you need to do is define the work to be done. It's up to you to write the code to execute the task. This can be in a servlet or in an endpoints function. It just needs to be somewhere that can be accessed by a URL. Another thing you're going to need to do is to configure the queue, and you do that in queue.xml. If you're using the default queue, you actually don't have to do any configuration, but if you're using anything other than all the defaults, you're going to need to configure your queue in queue.xml. So here's an example of the content of queue.xml. You have the queue entries element that contains a queue element for every queue that you want to configure. You specify the name of the queue and the rate that it operates at, and there's a bunch of other parameters you can specify as well. And then you're going to need to write the code to add the task to the queue. You need to start by getting the queue, and you use the queue factory to get a queue. If you want the default queue, then you just call getDefaultQueue on it. If you've configured a queue in queue.xml and you want to use that queue, then you call the getQueue method on queue factory and passing the queue name, where the queue name is the name from queue.xml. And then you need to specify the options for the tasks. The options include the parameters for the task and the URL that's going to execute the task. And the easiest way to build up the task options is to use taskoptions.builder. You must provide the URL that's going to execute the task. And when you use taskoptions.builder, you just call the withURL method and you pass the URL that's going to execute the task. Then to add params to the task, you can just call the .param method and pass in the params. You can have as many as you want. Here I've just got 2. And if your task doesn't have any params, then obviously you don't need to do that. You can write the code that adds the task to the queue inside of a transaction if you want. And to do that, you specify the transaction as the very first argument to queue.add. And when you're using Objectify, you can just call the offie.getTransaction method to get the current transaction. It's important to understand that you can put the task on the queue during a transaction, so the task only gets put on the queue if the transaction is committed, but the execution of the task takes place outside the transaction. The task is going to be executed whenever the task gets to the top of the queue, whenever that happens to be, so long, of course, that the transaction has already been committed. So let's take a look at the send confirmation email servlet. This servlet has a doPost method that sends an email whenever anybody creates a conference. We're implementing it as a servlet rather than as an endpoint function because this functionality needs to be completely internal to the application. We absolutely don't want anybody else to trigger the sending of these emails. We've written this servlet for you. You can find this servlet in the Lesson 5 folder if you want to. We've already defined it for you completely because our goal here is not to teach you how to use email, but how to add a task to a task queue. However, if you prefer, you can write it from scratch yourself. And actually, I do recommend that you read through this code because it does help you learn how to send emails from App Engine, which is a cool thing to know how to do. So basically what we do is we get the email out of the request, we get the information about the conference out of the request, then we create the body for the email and include the information about the conference that just got created. We set the from field, we add the recipients, we set the subject, we set the text, and then here we send the email. And then we catch the exception in case the email didn't get sent. One thing to be aware of is that if there's errors in your code and the email doesn't get sent, you're going to get an error in the log. However, if the email doesn't get sent because you've exceeded your email quota for the day, you're not going to get an error here. So if your email doesn't get sent, you might want to come and check your quota for sending emails. And you can see the quota page shows you exactly how many emails you've sent. Oh good, I've only sent one so far today. So you can add the send confirmation email servlet to your project as a done deal if you want, but then you do need to write the code to schedule the task, to add the task to the task queue. And to do that, you're going to need to update the create conference function to add the send confirmation email task to the default task queue. And you're going to be doing that yourself. First though, I want to show you that you can use the admin console to explore your task queues. So here in the task queues page, you can see the quota for your task queues. I've had one API call go out for task queues so far. You can see the individual queues get listed. I'm only using the default queue, so we only see the default queue here. So I drill down into it, and I have nothing in my queue. So I go to my application though and create a conference. See here I've created this conference, task queues for everybody. Now very quickly I'm going to go to the admin console and update my task queues page. Okay, I wasn't quick enough to see it running. You can see that one task ran in the last minute. If I check my email, I see that I've got an email confirming the conference I just created. So we see that my task ran and it ran successfully, but I wonder what happens if the task isn't successful. So over here in the create conference function in Conference API, this is the code where I add the task to the queue. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to change the URL for the task to be a non-existent URL. So now I've redeployed my app. It has an incorrect URL for the task that's going to be executed when I create a conference. So let's just see. Okay, my conference got created. Now let's go look at the task queues in the admin console. So now let's see what happens when I refresh the task queues viewer in the admin console. Okay, so now looking down into the default queue, I see there's one task in the queue. 2 were run in the last minute. It's running 5 per second. Let's drill down. See over here there's been 3 retries so far. I'm just going to leave that running just for a little bit. Okay, so far we've had 9 retries. That's probably enough. So I'm going to go ahead and purge the queue to get this task off the queue because it's never going to complete. It's important to understand that when a task gets onto the push queue and reaches the top of the queue, App Engine is going to keep trying to run it until it actually succeeds if you use all the default options. So it's really important to test your queues so that you don't get some task wedged in there that's never going to finish. But one other thing we can do here is we can look in the logs, and you can see that we do have this report that the task /send confirmation email _x, that no handlers match this URL. So whenever you see that kind of error, no handlers match this URL, that means your app's trying to do something with a URL that doesn't exist, and that often just means you've got a typo in your code. Yeah, and of course that never happens. And you can actually choose a different log level to show. So here if we just show warnings, we very quickly see the problem. No handlers match this URL, no handlers match this URL. It's pretty easy here to see what the problem was. So I've shown you how to use the task queue viewer in the admin console and talked about how to schedule the task. Now it's your turn to write the code to send the confirmation email whenever anybody creates a new conference.